Conversations, episode Shaquille O'Neal. I am your host, Kay Bex, and if you are a longtime listener joining us again, welcome back in. And if you're a first-time listener who has found us for the first time or has just given us a listen for the first time, welcome in. Very happy to have you guys either way, and hopefully you'll all be back for future episodes moving forward. For those of you that have listened to us in the past, it seems like it's a little bit disjointed now. I've not posted a new episode in something like a week and a half. And before that, it was a couple of weeks before the episode prior to that launched. So you're probably wondering to yourself, what kind of frequency is Conversations trying to establish here? And the answer is normally it's going to be weekly, but it's really tough right now. We're at a challenging part of the year, I would say, both from a sports perspective. Outside of the World Cup, it's a little bit of a lull period right now. And from a personal perspective, it's just been difficult to get on the mic. So I'm happy to be recording tonight. It's Sunday night. We're headed into the week of America's 250th birthday party. So hopefully this episode will be listened to you guys early in the week, which is also consequently for most listeners a short week as well, which should make everybody happy. But we are back on the track of recording. And if you're trying to figure out, with no other opportunity to do so, how you're going to keep up with Conversations' rapidly infrequent schedule, the best way to do that is to follow us, to subscribe to us, to like us on socials so that you can see our promotions of new episodes, of new content that comes out. That's the best way to do it. We're on all the majors: Facebook, X at KBX_ATC, Instagram at cornversationspod, and those things will all have promotional aspects when we release new episodes. Also, we're on all the major streaming platforms: Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, etc. If there's one that you listen to where you can't find us, let us know. We'll try our best to get it on there if we're not already. But those are the best ways to follow us forward, and we'll let you know when we have new content out there so that you don't have to be left guessing. We've got an episode packed with more soccer content as the World Cup transitions from the group stage to the business end of the tournament. That's the knockout rounds where it's win or go home. But before we dive fully into that, and we will do a little bit of that today with the U.S. men's national team, we're going to pour one final one out for all the teams that did not make it from the group stage to the knockout rounds, because for those fans and supporters and federations, there were a lot of good memories made, even though they are no longer going to be going any further in the tournament. So we'll break that down, and then we'll move on to the U.S. men's national team, which is the hot topic that I think most listeners are going to want to understand. What can we expect moving forward from these guys? And then we'll do a short segment on a little piece of news from the PGA Tour that they kind of snuck in there, given everything that's going on with the World Cup. I feel like pretty much everything else, unless you're a diehard of a different sport, is kind of background noise compared to the World Cup right now. There will surely be people listening to this who will call me on that, but I am a firm believer that unless you've got massive, massive news coming out of another sport, that most of the headlines are being dominated by the World Cup. And frankly, this is my show, KBEX, and I am most interested in the World Cup right now. So that's what we're going to cover for the most part here. Talking about the group stage and pouring one out for the teams who are no longer with us. 16 teams were eliminated officially at the end of the first three matches of the tournament. Those 16 teams did have a lot of moments, though, that'll be savored by those fan bases, and really whether or not they come away feeling privileged and honored to have been part of the experience, or whether or not the results are going to potentially result in bigger changes from a federation standpoint, really depends on the team itself. So what I wanted to do here was break down each of the teams that were eliminated in the group stage and categorize them based on their level of disappointment that they should be feeling. And I broke it into three different categories. We've got little to no disappointment, we've got mild disappointment, and we'll end with major disappointment. So, starting off with little disappointment, these are the teams that I think can look back fondly on the experience despite the fact that they are not moving on into the knockout rounds and feel like it was still something that they'll look back on in 20, 30 years, whatever it may be, and have a positive memory of those three games that they got to play. And this is the biggest group because it is an expanded tournament this year, going from 32 to 48 teams. So naturally, we were going to have a number of teams where critics and the more negative mindset was that some of these teams didn't even belong in the tournament to begin with. Now, we're not going to really dive into whether or not that's the case, but three of the four teams that were debutantes in the 2026 World Cup were eliminated in the group stage, and three of those teams do make the list of having little to no disappointment for the obvious reason, which is that they were making their first appearance in a World Cup. So that is something that you can't take away from the fans. You can't take away from the federation. You can't take away from the players that were on the field. They will always go down in history in those countries as being the first to do it. So the list that I have here is Haiti, Curacao, Tunisia, New Zealand, Iraq, Jordan, and Uzbekistan. And just to clarify, the three teams that were debutantes in the 2026 World Cup were Curacao, Jordan, and Uzbekistan. And of those three teams, only one actually gained a single point. That was Curacao. In order to do that, they needed an exceptional performance from their goalkeeper, Eloy Room, who stood on his head making 15 saves in the match against Ecuador, which consequently was the match that I got to attend in Kansas City. So I am highlighting this for that reason, amongst other things. It was probably the most interesting 0-0 draw that I have ever watched in my life, not just because I was personally there, but because Eloy Room was fantastic in goal for Curacao. And despite the fact that about 90% of the fans in the stadium were rooting for Ecuador, if they were rooting for anyone at all, it was very much felt the 5,000 or so fans behind one of the goals that were Curacao fans. They made themselves known during those 90 minutes because their goalkeeper and really the entire defensive tactics that they put together against Ecuador gave them a performance that they will not forget for quite a long time. But most of the teams in this group of little to no disappointment didn't really do much in their groups. You think about teams like Haiti, Tunisia, Uzbekistan. They really struggled against some of the stronger teams in the tournament this year. And when they were matched up against most of those teams, there were only certain moments where they were truly competitive. But this is a group that did have their moments. When you look at New Zealand and their 2-2 draw against Iran, that was one of the better games of the first match day. You look at a team like Curacao that we mentioned, had their point. You look at Iraq, who went into Group I, which was the group of death, and really did, despite giving up 12 goals in the group stage, look like they belonged at points against teams like France and Norway and Senegal. And that is a difficult thing to do for any team, let alone a team that really was significantly overmatched from a personnel perspective compared with the rest of the teams in their group. So those are the teams that I would say coming away from things, they can hold their heads high and there will be little negativity from the fan bases coming out of the group stage, which they were not able to move on from. Moving on then to the mildly disappointing teams. And the reason that I have these teams listed is a combination of whether I had expectations for these teams or whether it feels like the federation or the team itself had expectations beyond simply participating in this World Cup. And the five teams that I have on this list are Czechia, Qatar, Scotland, Saudi Arabia, and Panama. So let's just break down a few of these teams. the first I want to start with is Czechia, because to me, this feels like a team that did not meet expectations for this World Cup. I actually had them winning Group A over the likes of Mexico, South Korea, and South Africa. And as it turned out, Czechia ended up finishing last in the group. And a lot of that really can be tied back to the fact that when it came down to it, Czechia did not seem to have the legs and did not seem to have the finishing quality that I thought they might be able to propel themselves into the knockout stages with. They were one of the taller teams in the entire tournament, let alone Group A, and yet it seemed very difficult for them to get good opportunities in the box in the final third, which is something that they were going to need to do because they were not a team who was going to be particularly explosive from a speed perspective, given some of the age that they had and some of the players that were their engine room, if you will, in the midfield. But they were never really able to get it done. The other thing that was disappointing about Czechia is that they were unable to hold on to leads. They actually had leads against both South Africa and South Korea and blew both of those leads. Those two results in particular were really the reason why Czechia is not moving on to the knockout rounds. Had they gotten a result against South Korea or the expected result against South Africa, they probably would have been looking at a knockout stage appearance. But that is not to be. And Czechia goes home really with some of the better players in their midfield, probably seeing one of their last appearances with the national team. So next time we see this Czechia team, they're likely going to look a lot different. And it'll be interesting to see how they move forward from this. Already, Patrick Schick, who is one of the forwards for the team, has announced his retirement from international football. And I expect that a number of the guys in the midfield, like Thomas Suchek and the like, will also be moving on from the team moving forward as well. Another team that I want to highlight here is Scotland. Unfortunately, no Scotland. The party does go on for the Scottish fans. That was not something that they expected, although at the same time, I feel like there was a little bit of pessimism going on within the camp, if only because results in the past have suggested that Scotland just can't find a way to break through into the knockout rounds. In fact, Scotland is the only team who has played in the number of tournaments that they have that would be considered major tournaments that have never made a knockout stage appearance. And you look at this tournament for them, there were opportunities for the Scotland team. Against Haiti, they got the result they were looking for, and ultimately they really only needed 1 point against either Morocco or Brazil to move themselves into the knockout rounds. And against Morocco and Brazil, you saw a similar team that you saw against Haiti. The difference was you were playing competition that was at such a different level from a quality and class perspective that it wasn't going to get you the result that you needed. And I think that's what's disappointing about this Scotland team is that when the opportunity arose for them to be brave, to take chances against teams that they were going to need to step out of their comfort zone a little bit to get a result against, they didn't take those opportunities. And in the end, I think you look back at the games against Brazil and Morocco and you see what could have been. Against Brazil, had they been a little bit more disciplined and clinical on the defensive end, they might not have had such a bad goal differential, which ended up playing a part in Scotland's ousting from the World Cup. And against Morocco, just not enough chances in the end third where they were going to have an opportunity to get a result there against the Moroccans. But the talent was there from Scotland, so that's why I have them in this mildly disappointing group. But in the end, I feel like the fans almost look at this like it was a sad but realistic expectation. And then the last team that I want to take a look at are the Panama team. This does feel like a team that got hosed to some extent when you look at their results. They came into the first match day with an opportunity to get a result against a Ghana team that many people felt like were the weakest team in Group L. and it was looking for almost the entirety of the match that Panama was going to get a point against Ghana. But then in the tail end of that game, in stoppage time, in fact, Ghana did get a goal past Panama. And I really think that that kind of set the tone for the rest of the group stage for Panama. Not getting that point against Ghana meant that they were going to have to do something extraordinary against either Croatia and or England. And with England and Croatia ending up needing some points, those Panama results ended up actually being pretty big for both teams. And so Panama was left with a really uphill battle after they lost to Ghana. And had they gotten that point against Ghana, I very much wonder whether or not they could have taken a different approach against a team like Croatia or against a team like England in that third match day to try to get themselves the results that they needed, because they were in all three of those games. And unfortunately, in both the Ghana and the Croatia matches, there were just moments that Panama um, let things go, and the quality from the opposition came through and ended up resulting in a goal. And so it really points out the differences of inches, really, and moments in the World Cup and how tight these groups can really be. And I think Panama is an excellent example of that, despite the fact that they finished last place in the group. And despite the fact that they actually did not get any points out of this group, they were very much in the running to get results out of at least two of those group stage games. And so I feel like there's mild disappointment there, despite the fact that Panama was one of the two teams that most people did not expect to do much. They were very close. And I think when you're that close, you can't help but wonder, as both a supporter and a player, what may have been if just a few things had gone a little bit differently. So now I want to focus on the final four teams that did not qualify for the knockout stages. And I would consider all four of these teams to be feeling major disappointment coming away from the results that they got out of this World Cup. And what we'll do is we'll go from 4-1. So the least disappointing of this group to the most disappointing. Of course, this is all opinion here, and things are starting to come out actually from the federations of some of these groups that would suggest maybe the numbers are a little bit different from their perspectives, but we'll touch base on those briefly when we discuss each of these teams. At number 4, I have South Korea. The reason I've got them at number 4 here and a major disappointment is that it felt like after the first group stage game that this South Korea team was in prime position to not only get out of the group, but potentially get out of the group in first place. The way that they were able to come back against Czechia, play their game, and get a result there in the later stages of that match suggested that this was a team that was going to be gritty. They were going to be a tough out, all the things that we expected of them coming into the tournament. And then when they were unable to get their result against Mexico, we said, okay, well, this is a situation now where a point against South Africa should be enough. In the end, it turns out that it was not enough. When we look at South Korea's, if you were trying to draw South Korea and what they did in this group stage, I think you would look at what they did kind of like the meme that you see sometimes describing Game of Thrones, where it's a really nice picture at the beginning, and then as you get to the very tail end, the business end of the group stage, things really just fell apart and it became a child's drawing. And that's what I think you could look at with this Korean team. It started so well. They came back against a Czech team that I felt like was also going to be a contender in Group A, and it just went south from there, from the result against Mexico, which was somewhat expected, to the unexpected result against South Africa that ultimately resulted in those two teams swapping spots in the final group stage match day. It is something that I think the Koreans are going to look back on and they're going to be very disappointed with themselves. In the end, there wasn't enough quality up front, and there's also question marks about the tactics that were taken out by the manager. There might be some major changes coming from this federation as to what they can do to ensure that they take advantage of the talent that they do have, because in the end, the talent they had up front is world class. They're playing in top leagues, but they really didn't show it in those final two games. And number 3, I have the Iranian team. Now, some people would look at this and say that Iran didn't do enough to break out of their shell, and they were expecting draws to get them into the group stage, or get them out of the group stage, rather. I look at this as an Iranian team that looked at what was in front of them in this group. It was a relatively difficult group with Belgium and Egypt joining the Iranians and New Zealand, and they took calculated risks when it made sense. In the end, Iran was probably the most unlucky team in match day 3 because of what happened in the Austria-Algeria game, which ultimately resulted in Iran being ousted from the tournament at literally the dying embers of that Algeria-Austria game. I can't imagine being in that camp and seeing what happened in the beginning of stoppage time of that game in Kansas City and feeling like there was little to no way that you weren't moving on from the group stage. And then just a couple of minutes later, in the most spectacular fashion, it being ripped away from you just as quickly as it was given to you. You think about what the Iranian team had to go through with regards to the team's travel and what they had to do as far as their base camp was concerned, moving that from the US to Mexico, and just the general noise that was surrounding this team with everything going on, as far as the geopolitical tensions are concerned. And it did seem like it got to this team. At the very least, the leadership was going to make it known that they were unhappy with the treatment that they felt like they were receiving. And despite that, I felt like the team on the field did almost everything that they needed to do in order to get out of the group stage. And, when you consider the teams that didn't make it, despite maybe not having the pedigree of the next two teams that we're going to list here, I think Iran was right up there with the best of the teams that were left behind, in terms of not making the knockout round. Number 2 on this list, I have Turkey. And similar to Czechia, part of the reason that I have Turkey on this list so highly is that I had high expectations for this team, and they really just did not come and deliver on all of the quality and class that they have. In the end, coming into the U.S. game, match day 3, which was really a meaningless game for both teams, but in the case of Turkey, you saw what they were able to do in the final third, but where they failed in the first 2 games was their execution. I think it was something like 62 shots on goal and 0 goals to show for those first 2 games. So 62 sounds high, so it couldn't be that. But the reality is that this team has a ton of quality up front. Now, looking back, we may question whether or not the quality was too young for the moment. Perhaps the players like Arda Güler and Yildiz up front that are both going to be great players for the next decade in some of the top leagues in Europe, from a domestic league standpoint, are also one of the youngest guys to play in this tournament as well. And so when you consider that up front, where a lot of their class was and a lot of the expectations were being formed, you wonder whether or not the moment was just too big for them. They didn't appear ready in the first game against Australia, and in their second game against Paraguay, it just didn't feel like they were capable of getting over the hurdle that's necessary to put the ball in the back of the net. The chances were there, but the execution was not. And this is a very proud footballing nation. Uh, there were videos in Turkey for the send off of the national team heading into the World Cup, and it was quite a sight with a number of vehicles following the team as they moved their way to the airport to head over to the U.S. And there were a lot of disappointed and angry fans back home. And I do think that this is going to result in some hard looks at what they're doing from a federation perspective. The players are there, but perhaps the leadership is not. So it'll be interesting to see what Turkey A does moving forward. Obviously, they'll have another opportunity in 2 years' time in another major tournament at the Euros, where they can make good on some of the talent that they have. But this was absolutely a disappointment for a team that I felt like could make a fairly deep run into the knockout rounds. And then number one on this list is the Uruguayan team. Now, Uruguay did come into this tournament with some question marks about their ability to score. And what we ended up finding out was that those were not question marks that should have been discounted, because this Uruguayan team was abysmal in the final third. The quality just was not there. There were also rumors of in locker room strife happening between the players and the manager. And in the end, it resulted in 3 goals across 3 games and 4 goals given up. So this was a team in South American qualification that was kind of all over the place with regards to its results. But one thing that it was doing well was its defensive prowess. And the defense was generally there. But what wasn't there was the finishing, and it did come back to bite Uruguay in the worst way possible. This was a group that, Group H, that looked like it was a tale of 2 sides. You had Spain and Uruguay, both that have World Cup titles to their names. And then you had Cape Verde and Saudi Arabia. Cape Verde, a debutante, and Saudi Arabia, a team that really has not done much of note in any World Cup of past. And it very much felt like this was a group that Spain and Uruguay were going to duke out for the top spot in match day 3. But by the time match day 3 rolled around, Uruguay was fighting for their lives. And they were fighting for their lives because they were unable to put the ball in the back of the net. The draws that they got against Saudi Arabia and Cape Verde did not make things any easier. But had they gotten a result against one of those 2 teams, obviously the situation would have been very different and Uruguay would have been moving on. In the end, there's going to have to be an overhaul from this federation. They don't have the leadership in place, clearly, to move forward in a proper way. And there are also question marks about where they're going to be able to find quality class talent that can work together to have better results in big tournaments like this. And so when you consider a team that has won 2 World Cups in the past, it is absolutely an unacceptable performance to get grouped in the fashion they did, in the group that they did, perhaps more importantly. In the comments, let me know who you thought your biggest disappointment of the World Cup so far has been. Obviously, with only 1 game having been played in the knockout rounds at this point, we're really only considering the teams that got grouped as part of that discussion. But as the tournament goes on, there will obviously be more opportunities to evaluate teams that didn't quite meet expectations for this summer's event. But one team that does still have the opportunity to achieve the expectations that have been set out for it, both by the team itself and the growing supporter base as the tournament moves on and has such a profound impact on the country is the US men's national team. So now that the round of 32 is completely set, we have full clarity at this point where the US's path to meeting those expectations will take them. And I want to take a look at that a little bit here in this episode. Obviously, we've got the first game, the round of 32 game, coming up this Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern time. That's a California uh, location for the U.S. In Santa Clara. They'll be taking on Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is absolutely a game that the U.S. should be able to win, given that Bosnia has been primarily a defensive outfit that is looking um, to punch back on the counterattack and do most of their damage on set pieces. The U.S. has looked far more offensively capable than the Bosnians. And the other thing is, the U.S. looks like they have fresh legs coming into this game, which is going to be important against a Bosnian team that is a little bit older, and will rely on some guys that might have some heavy legs coming into this fourth game. So when you look at the US's first game, I would absolutely say that there is an opportunity for them to move on into the round of 16. I would say it's almost an expectation at this point. And when we look back before the tournament, we had this discussion when I had J-Died on, and both of us said that we felt like a quarterfinal appearance would be meeting, if not exceeding, expectations for this team. And so, at the very least, the U.S. should be looking at winning at least one group stage game to be able to meet the expectations that now exist for this team, given what we see in front of them. But the side of the bracket that the U.S. has been placed on is a tough one. They have some real heavy hitters, from Germany to tournament favorites France, to the Netherlands and Morocco, Portugal, Spain, and teams like Belgium and Senegal, which would be the potential opponents that the U.S. would play on July 6th in the round of 16 if they're able to dispatch Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, taking a look at Belgium and Senegal briefly here, you're looking at two teams that, if this were the 2014 World Cup, I think that people would look at and say these are teams that the U.S. might not be favored against. But Belgium, being Belgium who they are in 2026, and consequently they were the team that dispatched of the U.S. in 2014, you're looking at a team that once again does not feel like it's firing on all cylinders heading into the business end of a major tournament. And that really comes down to the fact that they just don't seem to have transitioned their identity to their younger, more capable players at this point. It does still feel like they're relying on a golden generation that has aged at this point, and not being able to move on to that newer set of players where the quality and the ability to make runs on the wing with guys like Jeremy Doku has made Belgium look like a very beatable side in the group stage. Now, Belgium may not even make it out of the round of 32. In fact, I don't think they will, because the Senegal team that they are facing is a team that did what they needed to do in order to make it out of the group of death, Group I. They were competitive against a France team that maybe didn't have their best performance in match day one. And then against a Norway team, Senegal did seem like they were also capable, but couldn't get the job done against Erling Haaland and a very opportunistic and potent offense. But what Senegal does have is quite a bit of attacking talent in their own right, and things are coming together for them on the defensive side as well. It'll be interesting if Senegal does come out of that round of 32 game and ends up being the U.S.'s opponent in the round of 16, because this is also the team that the U.S. played just a month ago in its friendly. And while friendlies do not dictate what is going to happen in a match that actually has real implications to it, I do think that having faced a lot of those guys once before in such short turnaround is going to give the team that might not be favored a little bit more capability to make good on things that they found out from that friendly. And I think if Senegal plays the US, that is what we're going to see is a US team that should win, a US team that has the talent to break through and win another knockout stage match against a team like Senegal. But it's going to be tough. Things absolutely ramp up, and maybe to take one step back here, I think that that is the marker of the path for the U.S. in the knockout stages is that each round is going to get tougher, presumably. And that's the way it should be in the World Cup. But it's also going to be tough to feel confident going into the next round as hopefully the US moves on because these teams are only going to get better and better. Now, moving into the quarterfinals, there's a pot of 4 teams that the US could potentially meet in that game. It would be on July 10th, and all 4 of those teams are Europeans. And 3 of them, you could argue, are European powers. The game between Portugal and Croatia, a round of 32 matchup on July 2nd, and also on July 2nd, the round of 32 matchup between Spain and Austria are the 2 games that could produce the quarterfinal opponent for the U.S. And I think this game is potentially where the U.S. finally comes up against a team where we could look at and we could say, okay, both on paper and based on perception, there is a thought that the U.S. would be the underdog in this game. Let's assume that the combination of Portugal and Spain is the team that the U.S. plays. I think when you look at this on paper, this is absolutely a game that the U.S. would come into and feel like an underdog. The talent on Spain's team is as good as any team in the world, perhaps save France. They just haven't been performing up to the levels that people expected of them heading into this tournament, which is, I think, a good thing if you're the U.S., because the U.S. has really exceeded the expectations that a lot of people had for them coming into the tournament. Likewise, Portugal is the same way. And I think Portugal is a situation where they just may not be able to get out of their own way. I mentioned this in the previous episode when we were taking a look at teams who had drawn in their first match day. And despite Portugal seemingly moving beyond that in their second game against Uzbekistan, there were opportunities in the game against Colombia match day 3 for them to get a result there that would have resulted in finishing first in the group, which would have prevented them from having to potentially face Spain in the round of 16. And the fact that they weren't able to do that suggests to me that, again, this is a situation where leadership for Portugal is going to ride or die with a guy in Ronaldo who isn't the same Ronaldo as he was even 4 or 5 years ago. And it'll be disappointing for Portugal if they're unable to go as far as I felt like they could have. I actually had them winning the tournament before the tournament began. And if they're unable to get past the round of 16, I think you look at it as much about the path that they had to take as you do looking at it as a situation where they had an opportunity to pivot in the group stage and they chose not to. And by choosing not to, they really made their own bed in terms of having to play a Spain team that might also be able to make a deep run themselves. So those 2 teams being the ones that the U.S. can come up against, I think that's where you look at it and you say, if they're able to get the job done, then it would be considered an absolute success for the U.S. men's national team. If they're unable to get it done, but they're competitive, if they inspire the supporters throughout the game and it's a game that people feel like the U.S. had chances to win, I think that they still can hang their heads high getting to that point. I think the only way that getting to a quarterfinals and it being seen as a disappointment is something unusual happening in the game. such as a blown lead late or a controversial call that results in a play that ends up being the result in the game, or just totally being run off the field in a way similar to what was experienced at times in the 2022 round of 16, where the US really looked outclassed by a Dutch team that ended up going on to beat the US 3-1. So there's multiple opportunities here, I think, for the US to continue to be seen as a success. I think so far you're looking at a team who absolutely has been a success. We've already talked about that at length here, and also a number of other outlets have done that as well. So not really too much more to say about this, other than the fact that the road is in front of the U.S. and it really hasn't changed too much in terms of what would be considered a success as far as results are concerned. But as the US and the World Cup in general continues on, um, a little bit of an under the radar announcement by the PGA Tour um, was announced last week that I think needs to be covered at least on the surface, because it's a much bigger deal than the amount of coverage that it received from a mainstream perspective would suggest. The PGA Tour announced last week that it was going to be making wholesale changes to the tour itself, which includes splitting up the tour into two different tiers, having promotion and relegation aspects related to those tiers, and reformatting the tour championship at the end of the season, both from a locale perspective as well as a format perspective that will have a significant impact on the winner of the tour championship. Now, let's start with the basics here, which are the two different series that the PGA Tour will be split into starting with the 2028 season. We have the Championship Series, which will essentially be the Tier A, consisting of around 120 players, roughly 24 events, and purses of those events that will be at least $20 million or more. We also will have a second series, which will essentially be the Tier B within the top level of the PGA Tour, called the Challenger Series. And the Challenger Series is going to be made up of roughly 140 players with 20 plus events on the calendar worth $4 million or more for individual purses. And what's interesting about the two tiers is that they're splitting up essentially what used to be a singular PGA Tour, where players from anywhere from the top of the FedEx Cup rankings all the way down into your 200 rankings would be able to play in top level PGA Tour events. And what the PGA Tour appears to be doing with this tier structure is separating that out and essentially creating signature events only for the top 120 players in the PGA Tour ecosphere. And I think what's interesting about that is that they are acknowledging what we've said on this show in past episodes, which is that the PGA Tour is as much about the players in the events as they are the events themselves. And I think that is a learning takeaway that the PGA Tour has acknowledged and has accepted, and is looking to capitalize on as the Live Tour appears to be crumbling, and there's an opportunity for the PGA to have essentially all of its best players back under one roof for all of its tournaments. And the other thing that I think that this is doing is it appears to be condensing the schedule so that all of the top players are happy to be playing in all of the signature events. You know, the worst thing that you can have is an event that you expected a lot of the top players to be playing in that isn't attended by a number or a handful of the players that are going to attract eyeballs, because ultimately that has a significant impact on how the tournament is going to be perceived, both from a sponsor's perspective, but also from a patron's perspective. And I think separating these two tiers allows the best players to feel confident that it's worthwhile for them to attend all 20 events. The other thing that this two-tier system is going to promote is a promotion relegation system. And in general, what it's going to do is it's going to reward the best players on the Challenger Series across the entire calendar year of events, and it's going to demote the lesser performing players in the championship series. So what will happen is that roughly 20 players from the Challenger Series after the end of the regular season will have an opportunity to be promoted to the championship series for the next season, whereas the lowest performing players, roughly 20 of them on the championship series, will be relegated down to the Challenger Series. And without special exemptions or opportunities dictated by things like injuries and other things that haven't really been defined yet by the PGA, the players on the Challenger Series will be unable to participate in any of the championship series events. And what that does, I think, is it allows players to, again, feel confident that all of the events that they're playing in on their respective tour are worthwhile to play in. Obviously, you don't want to be one of the lower performing players, because that's going to have a significant hit not only on your ability to play in the biggest tournaments, but it'll also have an ability for you to make the significant amount of money that the championship series will be offering as opposed to the Challenger Series. A couple of other points about this that were questions I originally had, just for clarification, is that Q School and the Corn Ferry Tour will continue to have a place on the PGA Tour's uh, tier. It's hierarchy, if you will, of opportunities for the professional tour. I think that that's good for the younger players, for continuing to establish the Corn Ferry Tour as something that courses and players will want to continue to play on. And it also opens things up for those players to have yet another opportunity to qualify for a next step up. So players will be able to make a name for themselves in the lower tiers before they make it to the championship series, which does help from a recognition perspective as you get to that top level, which is really what I think the PGA Tour is looking for by condensing the number of players that are allowed to play in what will essentially be 20 or so signature events on the top tier of the series. The last thing that they have announced so far, that is a major change from how it currently works on the tour, is the postseason changes, particularly to the tour championship. From a locale perspective, they're now opening this up to multiple venues across the U.S., as opposed to it singularly being at East Lake Golf Club in Atlanta, which is where it has been for the past years. And secondarily, and perhaps more interestingly from the fans' perspective, the Tour Championship will feature a combination of group stage and knockout round match play, as opposed to what they do now, basing that final tournament on where you are in the FedEx Cup standing. So that's been something that both the players and fans have been clamoring for quite some time, is a return to a match play that has significant bearing on a final championship, and fans are finally going to get that now, which I think is quite interesting, that they're doing a group stage knockout round format. It's something that at this point in time seems interesting, because it is very much playing to what the Premier League and the World Cup and other global soccer formats have found is best, which is an opportunity to have a winner go home scenario for a championship, but also have group play to help manage the seeding for that match play as well. So some some pretty major news by the PGA Tour. It'll be interesting to see as this rest of season goes on, but as we close up the World Cup and start to be able to focus on some of these other leagues more intently, like the PGA Tour, how this information will start to disseminate amongst both viewers, diehard viewers of the sport, but also the more casual viewer as well. I feel like this one has definitely, as I mentioned earlier, gone under the radar a little bit, but these are major changes. This is something that is going to separate the players that are, household names on the tour from ones that might have an opportunity to break through at a tournament every once in a while. And in terms of the match play at the end of the season to decide the tour championship, it's just another opportunity to create a level of urgency in terms of watching all of these players play in that particular event, as opposed to if you have a situation where a player is running away from the event or running away with the event, that there is the possibility that you start to get eyeballs tuning out. And match play essentially guarantees that there's going to be some level of drama li- going down to the final pairing or the opportunity to actually lift a trophy. So in the end, I think that it's a good decision by the PGA Tour to do this, both from a fan engagement perspective, but as well from a player engagement perspective, given that they're condensing the schedule to some extent and ensuring that there is a true meaning for each of the tour stops that they'll make starting in 2028. That's all I've got this episode. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed it. Again, the World Cup is into the business end of its play. So it is now time to focus. It's not anymore looking at how a result will affect the teams and their positioning going into match play. It is quite literally win or go home. So hopefully, you guys all enjoy that. It should be a great first week to the to the knockout round play. And it'll also be a great week for those of us in the United States as well as we celebrate America's 250th birthday. Hopefully, we'll get a U.S. men's national team win heading into that, and we'll have an opportunity to see them play after the holiday as well. But wherever you are and whatever you are watching, enjoy it. And until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.